So welcome, Liz. I would like to thank you for accepting my invitation to discuss the science of teaching and learning, particularly metacognition. I was looking forward to delving deeper into this research area. In fact, I'm going to start with a quote, and here goes. When students use metacognition, they become tremendously empowered as learners because they begin to be able to teach themselves. Can you elaborate on this?
Yes, certainly. Metacognition is about analysing your own thoughts and being able to change them in order to get a better result. So yes, I would agree with the term there that they're empowered. But I personally wouldn't use the word teach. I don't think that they're teaching themselves. I just think that they're learning more deeply. So I would say that they become able to think independently. And again, I would agree with the empowerment bit that they are becoming more engaged, more involved. They're starting to question things. It means they're no longer passive recipients of information. They've become active participants in something. And I think the importance of that struck home to me when I read the research of Marion Diamond, who died a few years ago, but in her earlier career was doing research into the brain. And she set up an experiment that led to a new understanding about the way the brain works. If I just explain briefly, was that she set up 3 cages of rats, one that had plenty of stimulation. They had lots of toys, tunnels, ladders, all that kind of thing, so that they could play all day. Then there was another cage of rats facing them that could see all the things that were happening in that fun cage. And then there was another group of rats faced the other way, so they had no idea what was going on. And she and her team were predicting what would happen to the life expectancy and the health of the rats in those 3 cages. And as expected, the rats in the cage that had all the simulation lived longer and were healthier while they were alive. And in fact, when they'd finished and they dissected their brains, they had really well developed brains. But what they found in the cage that wasn't facing them and it was facing the other way was that the rats did not live very long and they weren't very healthy. So that was expected, but what they didn't expect was what happened in the middle cage, which was that there was no difference between the middle cage and the third one, where the rats didn't live very long and were not very healthy. So being able to see the activity in that first cage didn't make any difference whatsoever. It didn't help their brain development. It didn't help the stimulation of them at all. And that was the beginning of our understanding about the fact that the brain needs to be involved in order to learn, that the brain is designed to learn from experience. And that's kind of been shown in experiments since then. Those were kind of the early days. But since then, we now know that the brain has to learn from having an experience. So using metacognition means that students are more able to engage with an experience because they're more able to have an active role and be involved. And then just thinking back to the teaching bit that you mentioned, I think the teacher still has a role in that they are the ones that are providing the learning experience, not teaching in the old traditional sense, but providing an experience that a learner can learn from. But the teacher is there to guide them on the side, to create the tramlines, if you like, within which that student will be working to find out what they need to know.
So, Liz, there are a number of misconceptions surrounding metacognition and the related construct self-regulated learning. Can you define these for us?
Yes, this becomes a bit difficult because experts will differ in how they describe this. So I think that's why there's some confusion. The term metacognition is credited to John Flavel, who was working in the 1970s on the idea of cognition, the way that children were learning. And cognition is the gaining of knowledge, the understanding of it, and then being able to use it. So that learning process that we're all familiar with. But he wanted to separate that out from the extra processes that are needed to analyze how someone is learning and so that they can improve results. And he wanted to separate the two. So he put the meta on the front as a prefix because that indicates going beyond or transcending the normal learning skills to think more about the actual processes involved. And it's interesting that he started that within education. But in fact, more recently, researchers have been trying to find out where metacognition actually exists in the brain. And they found that it's part of the decision-making process in the prefrontal cortex here, just behind the forehead. And that decision-making process allows us to analyze what the possibilities might be if we go in a certain direction, and to think about decisions we've made and whether they're actually beneficial to us or not, and then giving us the ability to change our mind and go in a different direction if we need to. But I think it's become overcomplicated because theorists have taken John Flavel's idea and added to it, and they start breaking it down into a whole range of different types of metacognition. So someone who's trying to research it for the first time, just as an example, I tried this. I went on Google and Googled metacognition to see what came up, and it starts to get confusing because depending on who you listen to, there are 2, 3, 4, or 5 different types of metacognition. And I'll give you an example here. I've got someone says that it's knowledge, experience, and strategies. Someone else said it's knowledge, regulation, and experience. Someone else broke the knowledge down into awareness and then broke that further down into declarative, procedural, and conditional types of knowledge. And then the regulation was broken down into control, which is where we hear more commonly about the planning, monitoring, and evaluation side of metacognition. And then someone else was saying there are 4 levels within each student. There's tacit, aware, strategic, and reflective. So my question would be, where's a school supposed to start with all of that? You've got a whole sea of different ways of looking at it. And so the temptation at that point is to not do anything because it's kind of frozen in fear of what do we do with this. And that's why I stick with the main idea that metacognition is the ability to rummage around inside your own head, see whether what you're thinking is producing effective results. And if it's not, find a different way of doing it. And rather than going into all those different details. I think that's important because when it comes to improving the educational chances of children and young people and their life chances that follow that, it's important that we put things into practice. If we spend all our time on the theories, then the learners never benefit from that. So for me, it's really important. That's why I work under the heading of metacognition in practice. Because I want it to be applied and I want schools to develop that kind of thinking ability in learners, and that parents have some idea of how to do that as well. And if we make something too complicated, then people are going to shy away from using it. So I prefer to focus on preparing children and young people for thinking metacognitively. And one of the difficulties that schools find with this is it's often been translated as thinking about thinking. But that in itself is an academic exercise. So we could spend an hour doing a lesson on thinking about thinking without a child ever visiting their own thoughts. So it leaves out the personal construct on the part of each individual learner, and that then muddies the waters a bit. So I prefer not to use that term, thinking about thinking. And you mentioned the self-regulation side of it as well, and that again, people have taken it in different ways. So you'll see some people talking about regulating their own thinking, because metacognition allows you to do that. You can, so there's self-regulation there. You're regulating or controlling your own thoughts. But people have also linked it to the regulation of behaviour, particularly in school. They want students to be able to self-regulate, and they're talking about behaviour at that point. But obviously being able to regulate your thinking enables you to also think through your behaviour and regulate that as well. So the two tend to become a bit entwined. But I would add to that this idea that we spoke of earlier, of it being part of the decision-making process. Because when we make decisions throughout life, we are regulating our own lives, as it were. We are the sum total of all the decisions that we've made. So that, again, we could say that is a form of regulation. So the connection between the two for me is that metacognition is what enables self-regulation.
Very interesting, Liz. Having had many years of experience working with children, as you just mentioned, young people and adults, to support their learning, how do you develop the skill of metacognition in learners so that they can exceed expectations and become more successful learners?
Yes, this is one of the things I'm passionate about. It requires a growth mindset and active participation, which is something that's missing for a lot of students. And for me, the prerequisites of being able to think metacognitively is a knowledge of self, having a positive self-concept, appreciating how learning actually happens, and then being able to put the two together to recognize your own role in that learning process. So I created something that I call the learner success pathway, which is a set of materials that I use for many years with students in school. To help them build those prerequisites. I help them get to know how the brain works and then how their brain works. We analyze the strengths that they're bringing to any learning situation, and then we use all that to create a learner profile. And the importance of that is that they see they've got I use a shield. They've got a shield that represents them as a learner and all the positive things about them as a learner. And then it also helps them to understand difference, that every learner, all the other people in their class are going to have a different profile to them. They'll have different strengths. And so they become more able to accept difference and accept themselves with a sense of belonging, if you like, because often these students don't feel particularly like they belong in school. Then the next step is really to help them understand that learning process, which involves challenge, making mistakes, and practice. And one of the problems is that a lot of students will shy away from challenge. They either physically run away or mentally switch off. But they're also afraid of making mistakes, and they don't see the value of practice. But in fact, meeting a challenge, the reason it's a challenge is because it's something we've not met before. And then experimenting with it and making the mistakes and finding out about it. And then when we've got it, the practice to make it more memorable, that is the learning process. So we can't have students who are running away from challenge or making mistakes or practice, because otherwise they won't learn effectively. So that's one of the things that I work through with them. I also teach them how to plan for success, because by identifying their natural strengths, which they then are able to acknowledge as the stuff they find easier to do because it comes naturally to them. We then look at the things that are not on their shield, in other words, the things that they find more difficult, and we look at ways of overcoming those difficulties, but they find it easier to accept, oh, it's not on the shield, so of course I'm not going to be good at that. And so they can accept that there are some things that won't come naturally, and that when it doesn't come naturally, more effort is required to make it happen. And that means that you can kind of gradually hand over responsibility for their learning to the student. They naturally, by working their way through those things, they naturally become more independent. And I had lots of experiences of students coming back to a next session with me and saying, oh, look what I did, look what I did. And what they've done is they've taken something that they've learned and applied it somewhere else and created something of their own or done something differently as a result. And they became excited by it because they knew what to do to help themselves, because they were becoming more independent and taking more responsibility. And it's not subject specific, so they could apply it anywhere that they needed it. The other thing that they need is help to overcome emotional responses, because a lot of students that find learning difficult have emotional responses to that. So I work with them to understand the difference between their conscious mind and their subconscious mind, and what's happening when they feel stressed in school, and then also how to take control of that so that they can overcome it. And also Unfortunately, they're going to have to prove themselves by assessment. So one of the things that I feel is important is that we equip them for that. So I also work with them on memory skills and study skills. And then after we've done all of that, after they've worked their way through the learner success pathway with me, we then tackle the subject area that they find the most difficult, and they suddenly find it's not so difficult after all. They now have a different view of themselves as a learner. They have a more positive view of their abilities, and they've started to think more metacognitively.